Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we reject coercion and hypocrisy. This is episode 215, and I thought I'd talk about one of my favorite TV shows, Lie to Me, and I think it has a little bit of relevance today. So it is a show, and the following information here, this little bit background information comes from the www.paulekman.com, Paulekman. And he's the person that the show is based on, Dr. Paul Ekman. He's a psychologist and expert on facial expressions. Uh, so some, and the premise is that some expressions of the face are universal, regardless of culture, historical context, social context, doesn't matter. People have certain universal expressions. Now, originally, Paul Ekman didn't want to be a part of the show. He didn't really support the project, but when he was in LA, he met with the people who were trying to make the show a reality, and they told him that whether he was going to be involved in it or not, the show was moving forward. So he chose to be involved. He had a couple of conditions. He wanted the main character, who's basically going to be based on him, to be as complete, to be as different from the real him as possible, mostly for his own privacy. And as we know, academics are generally kind of boring, so he didn't want that to be part of the show. He only had really some measure of influence in the first season. And after the first season, the writer changed, then they didn't really care about the science anymore. And it was pretty much downhill from there. As a viewer, I did notice that after the first season, there was a big change in the way the show was made. And so I always tell everyone, just watch the first season. The first season is the best of the three seasons. And that's because they focused on the science, which is basically how to read people's faces and realize that they are not being completely honest with you. Now, the show, and so basically, he agreed to sign on to the show if he was allowed to make a blog post or have a sort of a vlog, ongoing blog. Yeah, the show is a little bit old, but as each episode came out, he would make some clarifications because the show was only 40 minutes long, and so they had to compress the actual time that it would take to study an individual, how long it would take, etc. And I think that is to be sure. In other words, if you watch this show, after 30 seconds, then Cal Lightman, the name of the main character of the show, he would say, he's lying. This is where it is, not here, it's there, that kind of thing. And so they had to compress it a lot. And so he would, take time to explain what was real and what was, TV show. But I assume that basically the show's science is more or less in the ballpark, at the very least. So the face has 43 muscles to make all of these different facial expressions, disgust, nervousness, excitement, joy, etc. Now, in comparison, the leg has 200, and the area of your body that has the highest concentration of muscles would be your hip area, gluteus maximus, upper leg. Uh, so basically, the character of the show would uh, look for people who had very little contact beyond its own tribe or its people. So he tried to find a remote population to prove that certain expressions are universal, right? So people in Asia don't make the same face for disgust as they do in Europe because they encountered Europeans once upon a time, thousands of years ago. No. But that no matter where you go, people will express joy in the same way, disgust in the same way, pain in the same way, shame in the same way, right? So certain expressions are universal. And so even if you can't understand the language that someone is speaking, you don't understand the culture that people have, you can understand their facial expressions, right? That something doesn't sit well with them, something is not appealing as opposed to something which is very appealing. Um, so what I loved about the show was that as it would, in the first season especially, as it would go through the mystery or the crime that they're trying to resolve or the question they're trying to answer, they would show real life examples of the expressions that they're talking about, right? So if there is shame, right, or anger, they would show you pictures of individuals who had that very expression, ripped from the headlines, as it were, right? And so you kind of have to be aware of the current events from like 20 years ago. Is it 20 years ago already? Yeah, about 20 years ago to know kind of exactly where those faces came from. Dick Cheney is in there. Bill Clinton is in there. Cato, Cato Kalin, is that his name? From the O.J. Simpson trial, and so you see all these um, faces and you recognize them and you kind of recognize the context from where the picture came from. And you're like, ah, okay. So there are people in the world that kind of know that, or get at least get a sense that someone is not being completely honest, that something else is going on. The show did talk about people who are naturals, right? So basically, Ekman, the premise of the show is that some people have to learn how to, and they train themselves to be able to see when someone is exhibiting micro expressions, right? And so this is not to be confused with the microaggressions that you know in race theory, but this is sort of very subtle movements that happen on a person's face, that they're trying to hide the fact that they're happy, hide the fact that they're angry, but they can't help but leak some of their emotion onto their face, and it's only, the show basically says that only sociopaths and psychopaths who basically experience no emotion, those are the people who typically are able to control their facial expressions because they don't feel anything. And so someone has to be really trained, or someone naturally knows how not to give away, uh, what they're thinking, like the mood or the emotion that's going through their mind. And so the show does talk about naturals, however. So you have people who had to learn how to spot certain things, and then you have other people who are naturals. Now, I don't believe that the person who is natural can see everything, but something which is very narrow to their own personal experience. So, for example, victims of abuse, right? So, the one individual who was identified as a natural is someone who was a victim of abuse. She had an alcoholic father, and so she had to learn how to recognize what mood that person is in, to recognize when that person might all of a sudden become violent. And as a result, that person really focuses in on body language, facial expressions to learn how to read and understand what those things are very, very quickly. So body language does give away a lot. I mean, this is not some kind of, outlandish idea. I mean, some of us already are like, oh yeah, I know what you're talking about. But there's another YouTube channel that I sometimes watch. It's called Active Self Protection, and they use real life videos to go over, um, how to read a person, what you might want to have done, or what the person did correctly, basically to how to defend yourself. And so they discuss body language. How do you know someone is aggressive? How do you know someone is preparing to attack you? How do you know someone is taking a defensive posture? And so you learn to read the body, right? And so that's more of a body language thing. The show focused more on face, although there is a little bit of the body language. It's mostly face. I think my dad was something of a natural because when he was a child, that was when Korea was occupied by the Japanese. And because he was a Christian, Christians were targeted by Japanese who wanted all Koreans to forget about being Korean and become completely Japanese, which included worshiping and participating in the Japanese Shinto religion. And so Christianity became, if you practiced it, secondary to the Japanese religion. And if you refused to bow to Shinto shrines, then you were beaten. And so I think my dad, from a very young age, he learned to recognize the signals that, oh, here comes a beating. Oh, something is about to go down, and so he was able to, on top of the fact that he was very, very intelligent, but I think that added to, the knowledge base that he was able to use in order to do the things that he was able to do. Now, most of us, though, we do get, especially if we're around lots of people all the time, like if you're an instructor or if you work customer service, or if you just get out a lot, you party a lot, it doesn't really matter. If you see lots of people, you can kind of get a sense when something is off. You might not know what it might actually be, but you realize that something is off, positive or negative. Generally, negative vibes are the ones that really get people to pay attention a little bit more, like that creepy vibe, right? Oh, something is creepy. And it's very difficult to know if you are coming off in a creepy kind of way. Believe me, I know. But anyway, like, so you try to be one way, but then you realize when you look at people's faces that, yeah, they're so not reading it in the way that you were intending. And so you kind of have to back off. And so that there's that as well, learning how to not only read a person who's talking to you, but be able to read the face of the people that you are with whom you are talking and seeing what their reactions are. Uh, so there's the show. It's a great show. I highly recommend season one. It's very entertaining. The subject matter, though, is a little bit racy sometimes. So if you have young kids, super young kids, you definitely probably want to watch an episode first before you let them watch it. Uh, Let me see. So after watching the show, you realize that there are a lot of people who don't realize that they're being lied to, right? So there are all these examples of people lying, and then you realize that there are so many people who don't see it. So maybe they're naive, or maybe just they just don't want to think that way, that it's too negative, it's too cynical to be looking to see if someone is being honest, or they're disingenuous, or they're just straight up lying to you. But for me personally, it was really important as a young person growing up in America, because I am not white, right? And you got it from every which way. I think I mentioned this before, but you're not white, you're not black, and so you got it from there. And you're not actually Asian either, right? Because when you got people coming off the boat, right, more recent immigrants, I was born here, and so that's why my accent is more, you know, urban than it is, you know, if you know a lot of Koreans, you know that a lot of Koreans who grew up in the church have a certain kind of accent, right? It's a kind of reminiscent of the mall chick, if you remember that era, where girls who went to the mall all the time, they always their sentences always went up. Um, so you have to know. Uh, it's important to know someone's intent, right? So when the voice goes up, that's what a lot of Koreans who went to church when they were younger, they learn that speech pattern. I don't have that. Um, and so people who were from Korea would always kind of look at me and say, "You're not really Asian." And so it was just that's where I got all my identity, racial angst, and had to get a PhD to try to figure all that out. But anyway, I had to know someone's intent. And plus, because I was sheltered, I was never really allowed out. And so when I did finally have to go to college, I had a lot of bad experiences because I didn't know how to read people. Um, and so basically, I want my kids to know. I make them try to pay attention to other people's body language and facial expressions, etc. Then as a pastor, I have to know if someone is going to, is there to play me. A lot of people don't realize this, but con artists love churches, right? Because when you show up, no matter who you are, everyone there has to love you. Everyone has to welcome you, and that makes them easy marks. So hopefully I'm not giving any of you any bad ideas or inspirations, but right. So, especially in the Korean church, there are many, many con artists, and they love going from church to church, ripping people off. That was the most common thing to see people make a play for other people's money. And there's the short game, there's the long game. I've known people who played, waited 10 years before they would spring the trap. And there are reasons for that as well. And so you need to know, especially to protect your congregation, your flock, as it were. You got to know when someone is up to no good, right? Uh, and if you really wanted to know, it's pretty easy to spot, I would say 70, 80% of people who are not being totally honest. I mean, the signs are so obvious, right? Now, when I say this, the only people who really get offended are like when I said this in church, right? The only people who really get offended are the people who had a crush on the person who I just flagged, right? Like, oh, that person is something going on with that person. Be careful. And the person who would get upset if they were really interested in that person, like they wanted to date that person, right? They would get upset, like, wow, you just ruined it for me. Then another type of person who gets offended when you talk about lying is the player himself, him or herself. Like, how dare you suggest that this is important to know in the church? It's just all about love of God, right? I mean, why are you talking about lying? And then you have the naive idealist, right? They get offended. I used to have sessions where I would force my youth group to watch episodes so that they can learn some of the body language, facial expressions so that when they're dating someone, they can tell if someone is not being completely honest. I'm more of a preventative kind of person. I would much rather, get people to break up early than to have a divorce later, right? So breaking up is a lot less messy than a divorce, especially if you already have kids, right? So I'm more about preventative care than about trying to fix things after the fact. But some people just really cannot see. They can't see the tells. They can't see the little micro expressions. And in those situations, I have a different method to use. I tell people, "Oh, you didn't see that? Okay, you can't tell that that person is not really being honest. Okay, well, here's another method. And this method is slower and much more time consuming, but modern technology has made this a lot easier. And the other method that I always tell people to use is try to remember everything that the person is saying. So you're interested in someone, you're trying to find out if they're eligible for marriage. Well, when you have your conversations, be very intentional with your conversation. And this, no one ever listens to me. Okay. So yeah, I give the advice. It's rarely taken. But anyway, you try to be intentional with your conversation, try to remember everything because a liar will always eventually contradict themselves. They'll always, say something different, which doesn't match or line up with what they had said earlier. Happens every single time, right? It's easy for me. Like I spot the liar all the time. I spot the contradiction all the time. And, of course, people get mad at me. There's like, oh, but they love me. It's like, okay, whatever. Um, so if so the great thing is that we have X now, formerly known as Twitter, right? So things that people have said in the past, you can dig it up. Right? So now we're going beyond the personal relationship to politics and popular figures, congressional leaders when they say something 3 years ago, but then say something completely different, 180 degrees opposite today, without any kind of confession or explanation as to why they changed their position, they are lying to you. They are playing you. In other words, without a retraction, without an explanation as to why their position changed, they are playing you. They are trying to dupe you. Do the dupes know? Do the suckers know? Do the people who are being lied to know? Maybe. But then if they know, why do they go along? Are they in on it? But people like that, the sycophants, right? The people who are hoping to get some breadcrumbs off the table, that's not going to last long. As we know, authoritarian structures, right? You have the people who actually have the power, and then there's everybody else. And you will sacrifice those people when it is convenient. And so it's kind of interesting that people may get the sense or may realize that being lied to is a serious problem, but they don't really seem to care. And even worse, today we set up protection for liars. National security. This is national security, national interest, whatever they call it. And so that's why I don't have to tell you what I'm lying about. Or you give them money or let them have money to set up organizations so that they can keep their stuff secret. The NSA, they spy on us, but everything is secret on their side, right? And so this normalization of lying is just really weird. And the reason why we have to know when someone is lying to us is because lying is extremely expensive. I've mentioned this in other episodes before, but lying is extremely expensive, right? Not only because if you believe a lie, there's the opportunity cost, right? I should have done that instead of this, but you lied to me. And then there's the malinvestment. If you're a business and you're going on bad information, you put your money in the wrong place and now it's gone. Malinvestment, it's expensive. And then there's war, right? When people lie to us into war, that is ex massively expensive, not only in terms of capital resources, but also in human life, right? And wrapped up in war is all of the above, opportunity costs and malinvestment too. Instead of making bombs, we could have been making, I don't know, water purifiers. And then, of course, there's lying is a waste of time, right? You are not doing what you're supposed to do if you had better information, but now you are wasting your time. You're throwing away your time for doing some which is not even true. And so other people may get played, but if you understand this, like watch season one, and then try to do that, right? Like whenever you see on Twitter, someone saying, "Oh, this is someone 3 years ago, and this is them now," or those tweets which say, "Is this you?" Right? And so you're saying something completely opposite. Well, that tells you that that person is a liar. They are not to be trusted because otherwise they would say, "Oh yeah, yeah, I gave an explanation of why I changed my position, my perspective, my subjectivity, whatever." There always is an explanation if they're being honest. I was wrong before, now I have changed, right? So even Thomas Sowell, he said, "Yeah, I was a Marxist when I was young, and then I spent a summer working for the government, and now I'm not a Marxist." So there's a clear explanation why there is a position change. If there is not a position change, then you're just a sucker that they are lying to, and they know they can lie to you because you believe them no matter what, right? And so knowing that this is the reality, this is the kind of world that we live in, and it's getting worse, right? We have to take responsibility for the choices that we make and then make better ones, right? When we don't like the outcomes. Oh, kept listening to that liar because I thought that maybe that person would eventually tell the truth. No, you stop listening to that person and then listen to someone else. And I don't know. I like to think that my information that I'm having and spreading, disseminating is better than some other people that I know. And that, the outcomes, maybe not this year, but maybe in 10 years, maybe the outcomes won't even be visible until my children's lives, when they get older. And then they can look back and say, "Hey, Dad was right. Remember when everyone thought he was crazy? He was right." That's basically the game that I play. I'm looking at the 50 years ahead, what are my children and their children's lives going to be like? And hopefully that they will remember these lessons, avoid the toxic people who are more interested in their own selfish gain and no matter what the cost is imposed on other people, and make better choices, hang around better people. That's it for this episode. I hope it was entertaining, just like the first season of that show that you should all go and watch. And I will talk to you next time.